let's take a minute to kind of understand and appreciate the letterpress process. The letterpress was such an important invention in typography, and we talked about that a little bit last week, but it really revolutionized and made it possible for information to be widely disseminated. Suddenly, multiple copies of books could be printed, and there was just a lot more information out there once the letterpress became frequently used. So the letterpress is a machine, and you have these drawers, and in these drawers there are these blocks that are the letters themselves, and there's usually a drawer for each typeface and size. Then there are these spacers used, and a composition stick is placed into the frame. Everything is locked into place using these things called coins. And then the ink is mixed, spread onto the roller, paper is fed into the machines, and rolled through. The process sometimes was quite elaborate, often because it took so long to carefully lay things out. There would be a sketch that you worked from. So you would kind of brainstorm the layout first. You would sketch it out, and then you would start the process of actually putting it onto the letterpress. Sometimes there were tweaks that needed to occur, so you would do a test. And you can see that there's one of the cool things about the letterpress is, there were these little mistakes that occurred, little areas that didn't get fully inked. So there was sort of a texture sometimes that you could see. So it's kind of that, the little mistakes or the little variations in detail that actually make this process kind of cool and interesting. And artists and designers often use, the old style of printmaking to create really beautiful reproductions or prints. And so you can see here, this is, we're going to talk a little bit this week about the different types of letters. So you can see here, this is Divine is the typeface. And you can see this really, really thin, delicate leg the A has. And then this is Mode, which is a more geometric font, very similar to Futura. This is French Clarendon, number 2. And this is Cooper Black Condensed. And you can kind of see the blocks that were used to create them with the printer press. There's really specific typeface terminology that we're going to start to use in this class, so I wanted to introduce it this week. But the first thing to consider and think about with letters is the negative space. When letters are reversed, the white areas become black and new shapes become apparent. So this is kind of beautiful, where these are actually the negative shapes of all of the letters underneath, A, E, O, U, N. And the letter forms themselves are actually the positive shapes. The term counterforms is also another way of saying negative shape. And counter area is where space is contained by letter shape, and it can be either open or closed. Then we have the anatomy of the letter forms, and we're going to be looking at that really closely this week. We have uppercase letters, we have lowercase letters, we have these things called descenders, which go past the baseline. So when you're drawing or creating letters, the first thing you do is create the baseline, and that's where the letter kind of sits. And then parts of the letter might go below the baseline, and you also have this other line called the mean line, which is kind of where the top of the letter sits, or the top of the lowercase, or some lowercase letters. And then you would have parts of the letter that go above the mean line. The space between the mean line and the baseline is called the X height. And then the shapes that go below the baseline are descenders. The shapes that go above the mean line are ascenders. And then you have different terms to kind of distinguish these little characteristics within letters. Like, for example, the space here on the top of the E is called the counter. This little foot that's going off this H is called a serif. So There's also different types of capital letters. There's caps that are called full caps, and those would go above the mean line and below the baseline. And then there's small caps, which kind of fit neatly between the mean line and the baseline, usually. And then there's different types of numbers. There's the lining figures. They sit on the baseline and extend to the cap height. And then there is the old style figures, and they might drop below the baseline and extend only up to the X height. And then you have ligatures. These are where two or more characters are joined as a single unit. So the most common terms used to describe letters: characters, uppercase, lowercase, baseline, mean line, X height, ascender, descender, and counter. Those are terms that maybe after this week you should get used to using frequently. So keep thinking about this anatomy, and as we kind of go through, you'll see that there's even more terminology used to sort of distinguish the parts of a letter. So for example, here you have a crossbar, and that's what connects the straight line of a B to the curved kind of middle part of the B shape. You have a terminal, which is kind of like a serif. It's sort of the edge of the letter. You have the aperture, which is the kind of space here between the top of the E and the sort of tail of the E. And then there's a term called spine, and that's often sort of the main sort of structural component of the letter. So here it's the kind of line of the middle of the S. And you have the baseline, the X height. You have the cap height, which is the distance from the baseline to the top of the capital letter. So the cap height is sort of that highest spot with the capital letter, kind of where it ends. And then you have some elements that extend slightly above the cap height, and that example here can be seen with this K. So you notice the top of the B is the cap height, but then you have this tiny little point on this edge of the K that kind of extends slightly above it. The curved elements of letters extend beyond the baseline. And so you can see that here. So for example, the S, it doesn't sit right on the baseline. It kind of dips slightly below. And even though this dip is kind of going farther down than this straight line of the R here, it will all read continuously. And so anytime you have that curve, it might not sit exactly on that baseline. Point size refers to the entire piece of metal type, not just the letter. There's a little bit of extra space there to accommodate upper and lowercase letters and to prevent adjacent letters from touching each other. And another example, measuring from top of cap height to bottom of descender. So you can kind of see that the body size or the point size has to encompass a little bit more than just the exact letter shape. And if you think about the point size, you can think of it in terms of that block from the printing press. So the block would be a specific size. It might go a little bit above the letter and a little bit below the letter. And the way we sort of measure the size of the letter, we have points, we have picas, we have inches, and so it's kind of hard to understand all these terms. But 12 points equals 1 pica, and 6 picas equals 1 inch. 1 point equals 1/72 of an inch, or 0.35 millimeters. So that's kind of how you think about the sizing of these letter shapes. When you start to work with your type tool in Illustrator, you will immediately start thinking about points. And sometimes you need to translate points into inches. And so if you think about a point in relation to an inch, a point is 1/72 of an inch. And you can see kind of X height comparisons. So X height is really important to the way the letter feels, the personality of the letter, and the legibility of the letter. And even though typefaces might have um, a similar point size. For example, you can see this is a 100-point Helvetica and a 100-point Garamond. If they have different X heights, they're going to look really different, and the legibility of those two fonts is going to be really different, and the space they take on the page is going to be different. So the physical embodiment of a collection of letters, numbers, symbols, whether it's a case of metal pieces or a computer file, is called a font. And the design of that collection or alphabet is called a typeface. So a typeface is the way it looks. A type family or font family refers to a related collection of typefaces or fonts. So no matter how subtle the difference, the typeface you choose will greatly affect the appearance of the page. And so that's kind of distinguishing the difference between font and typeface. So here are some typefaces that you probably are familiar with. And there's also type styles. So a typeface is sort of like the family itself. And then the type style is a variation in weight or width of the letter forms within the typeface. So typefaces often have a variety of type styles. For example, Roman, italic, thin, light, regular, semi-bold, bold, extra bold, condensed, extended, light condensed, or bold extended. And when you look at these typefaces, these are what designers spend a lot of time thinking about and designing. But then they also might go ahead and design different type styles within that typeface family. Often, a typeface is named after the person who designed it. And it could also be named after the country it was designed in. So that sometimes is, or the town, or there's a lot of different factors. But it's the specific design of an alphabet. So a font is a specific typeface and type style. So when you have your typeface designed and you have your type styles designed and you sort of have a typeface and type style picked out, that's your font. Traditionally, it was an entire alphabet at one size in one typeface and one type style. Type families are a combination of all of the fonts, of all of the type styles of a given typeface. And these are some examples. So you can kind of compare here. The Roman font is the core or spine from which a family of typefaces derives. Italic fonts are based on cursive writing, and they have forms that are sort of distinct from Roman. Small caps have a height that is similar to the lowercase x height. And bold and semi-bold typefaces are used for emphasis within a hierarchy. Bold and semi-bold typefaces need to include an italic version too, usually. And a full type family usually has two sets of numerals, lining numerals and non-lining numerals. And there can be really large type families. This is an example of Gotham and all of the different type styles, fonts used in that type family. So there's also sometimes within a type family serif and sans serif versions. So for example, this is the serifed version of Scala, and you can see a serif is a little boot on the edge of a letter. And this is the sans serif version of Scala. There's no boot there. These are very simple without the sort of embellishment of the serif. But it's the same type family, Scala. Sometimes, if you're in a rush or you don't, or designers do this occasionally, you can fake a type family by slanting, inflating, or shrinking letters with a software. That is not good. You should always, if possible, find the correct the correct font, the correct style to use instead of trying to fake it. It will just look much better. So use all type styles that come with your typeface. Don't try to manipulate the type. And also, luckily, nowadays we have lots of resources as typographers. We have whole libraries of type families that we can access and use. So you never need to fake it. Small caps and numerals. So this is an example of a full cap, and you can see that this is the X height here. It's going above that X height, and it's larger. And then you have your small caps, which kind of fits really cleanly here between the two lines. And then you have the non-lining figures, which kind of stretch below the baseline here, and the lining figures, which actually stretch above the cap height here. This is an example of a ligature, two letters that are sort of joined together. And a lot of font families have them. If you are using a software, often you can turn the ligatures function off and have the two letters as separate entities. And we're going to also look at some typeface classifications. There are 5 classic typefaces. And within those typefaces, you have classifications. And so the first typeface, and we talked about it in our first lecture, is blackletter. It was invented in Germany in 1455. And then you have the Jensen typeface, which was invented in Italy in 1470. And they call this typeface humanist or Venetian. There's Garamond, which was invented in France, and it's considered old style. Then you have Baskerville, which was considered transitional, and it was invented in 1757. You have modern, which was invented by Bodoni in Italy in 1788. So the 3 main ones we're going to really talk about and think about are old style, transitional, or at least today, are old style, transitional, and modern. Transitional is somewhere in the middle between old style and modern. And these are not the actual typefaces you're seeing here, so we're going to analyze these in a second. But why did this happen? To bring order to the thousands of typefaces, scholars and historians have placed all typefaces within several categories or classifications. And so these classifications help us sort of organize and think about all of the different typefaces out there. So you have old style, transitional, modern, then you have Egyptian, which is also called slab serif, and then we have sans serif, which is like Helvetica, which we'll be watching a whole movie about. So what is the difference between these type families? Or type styles. So old style here has very thick strokes. There's heavily bracketed serifs, and this old style or Garamond was the first of its kind font in old style, or first typeface in old style, was created when printing technology was still pretty primitive. Once printing technology became more refined and technology advanced, there were more transitional typefaces that were invented. And basically, the difference between the old style and the transitional is there's sort of an increased transition between the thick and thin strokes. So you notice this line on the A is much thinner than the line over here. You also have sort of more sculpted serifs. Notice that's a little bit more pointed on the end here. And then with greater refinement, there were modern typefaces invented. Bodoni was the first, and you can see how they are much straighter, more geometric. The thick-thin transition is usually even more pronounced in a modern typeface. And they're very elegant with really extreme contrast. And there's almost no brackets, so you can see this is a really crisp line here. on the serif, as opposed to like more of a gentle curve on old style and transitional. So we're going to train our eye to see these type subtleties. Then you have Egyptian or slab serif, and this was when type design became more eclectic to meet sort of the needs of advertising. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, advertising and signage really took off. And usually this style is kind of identified by its really, really heavy, thick serif down here. There's not much contrast between the thick and thin transitions. With sans serif type, Helvetica probably being the most famous, there's no serifs. And sans serif fonts were around before the 20th century, but they weren't widely used. They were actually seen as being really ugly and unattractive. Helvetica changed all that. So they're very thick and blocky, and there's sort of a similar thickness all over, and no serifs. So you can kind of see over here, you have the Garamond, which is old style. You have Baskerville, more transitional. We have Bodoni, which is modern. We have Century Expanded, which is Egyptian or slab serif. And then we have Helvetica. The angle of stress is another way to sort of think about what distinguishes certain letters. So the angle of stress is the transition. And some typefaces or letters have a really dramatic angle of stress that's really tilted or oblique. There's some that are sort of more moderately oblique and less tilted, and then there's slightly oblique. There can be a vertical angle of stress or zero angle of stress. And these are all based on calligraphy, how the pen is held, the width of the nib, or the angle of the nib. And it's really about, if you think back to those scribes drawing the letters, it's the way they were like holding their writing device. Were they a little bit more tilted? Were they completely like upright? And so that angle of stress can help you really sort of distinguish between different type families and also between letter shapes. And then you have contrast between thick and thin strokes. So you have no contrast, which is usually what you see on sans serif. You have low contrast, and then you have really high contrast. High contrast is what we really see with more modern fonts or more modern typefaces. So think about when you look at a font, try to classify it and think about all the things that are distinguishing the letter shapes. Is there contrast? Thick and thin transitions and strokes? Are there serifs? Is there more a moderate angle of stress or a dramatic angle of stress? Are serifs slightly rounded, or do they have sharp edges? Is there very thick to very thin? Are the serifs straighter or sharper? Are the terminals lighter or sharper, straighter? So try to use this terminology to really describe the letter shapes when you see them. And then start to think, is it more old style, or is it more modern, or is it transitional? Transitional is usually the hardest one to identify because you're always kind of going in between old style and modern, and you're saying, oh, it looks kind of modern, there's really thick, thin transitions, but the serifs, you know, they're not quite as sharp. So then you might say, okay, it's transitional. And this is an example of transitional. Usually the ones that are the hardest to identify are the transitional ones. Okay, so think about this. Which are these samples? Are they sans serif? Are they old style? Are they modern? Are they Egyptian? Or there's another category I haven't really talked about that much called novelty or display, which doesn't fit into any category. And so if you have a font that's just way out there, way interesting, but doesn't really have any of the characteristics of sans serif, old style, modern, or transitional, or Egyptian, then you're going to call that typeface novelty or display. Okay, so obviously this one is the sans serif option. This one is the Egyptian or slab serif, and that's because of these thick, really chunky, blocky elements down here. And then this one, I would probably categorize it as transitional because the edge here is kind of softer. It's not really, really like straight and with a straight edge here. It's a little bit more curved. So I would say this is a transitional. So you're going to think, you're going to look, and you're going to have fun. You're going to really think sans serif, modern, thick to very thin, slab serif. This is an example of Egyptian or old style. And on our projects this week, you're going to start to identify things you see in advertising and sort of label them as being from one of these families. This is more novelty or decorative. And then this is actually called script. When you have something that's really calligraphic, almost like handwriting, gestural, you might identify that typeface as script. So our homework is you're going to classify this type that you find out in the world, and you're going to label it, and then you're going to identify like certain elements within the different letters. So you're going to look for contrast, you're going to look at the serifs, and you're going to think, what family would I put this typeface into? So here's example of Centaur, which is designed by Bruce Rogers, and it's based on Nicholas Jensen's Roman type from 1469. So a lot of times you'll find typefaces that are sort of based on these really old type families. Like, for example, Adobe Jensen, which was designed by Robert Slimbach in 1995, and it was based on Nicholas Jensen's Roman type that was created in 1469. So when in this class, you're actually going to be designing a font, and so, or a typeface. And as you do that, I want you to think about maybe these old type families, and kind of as you design yours, think which one yours would be classified as. Adobe Garamond, based on Claude Garamond's work in the 16th century. And Saban, designed in 1964, was based on Claude Garamond's and Jacques de Saban's work. So you can see that everywhere, these typefaces kind of based on these historical designs. This is Clarendon.
Mom?
Helvetica, Futura, and this was designed by Paul Renner in 1927. You have Trade Gothic, designed by Jackson Burke in 1948, and Bell Gothic, designed in 1938. This is Brookham Script, designed by Richard Lipton, and it's based on the lettering of George Brookham in the 18th century. You have Mistral, which is designed by Roger Escoffion in 1953. So we'll be talking about this during class, but or during our Zoom, but think about these typefaces that you're seeing in the world, and take a look at this week's assignments. And this is something that you're going to be doing this week, thinking about and having fun with.